Glad you're here. And tonight we're actually going to hear from Dr. Meyer's book, and I have a copy of it here. New York Times bestseller. I've actually written more books than Dr. Meyer has, but his one book has sold more than the rest of mine combined, and so it makes me a little sad. I just want to say that to you, but it keeps me humble. And so this is called Darwin's Doubt, the Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. And so what we're going to do is, I actually first of all, I'd like you to listen. I know that sounds like a strange thing. Of course we'll listen, but a lot of times what people do is they listen so they can ask questions rather than listen to learn. And because again, intelligent design is an area we're going to talk about, we're going to walk through. But I want you to listen to the case he lays out, and then we're going to have some dialogue and some Q&A afterwards. But first I need you to listen, I need you to learn, have an open mind, have an open heart to what we're sharing tonight. Let me show you a little bit about Dr. Meyer. Dr. Stephen Meyer has a PhD from the University of Cambridge. He has authored the New York Times bestselling Darwin's Doubt, I mentioned a minute ago, the explosive origin of animal life, Case for Intelligent Design, as well as the Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, which was named Book of the Year by the Times of London Literary Supplement in 2009. And so I'm going to give us a moment to pray. We're going to ask God to give us direction and clarity, and pray for Dr. Meyer as well as he speaks. Afterwards, we'll have time and dialogue for Q&A. I'll ask a couple of questions, sort of prime the pump, and give you an opportunity to come bring your questions, and then we'll kind of walk through your questions together, okay? Welcome, everybody. Pray with me. Father, thank you that by your grace and your goodness you've redeemed us and called us by name. Thank you that you've given us a mission in the world in which we find ourselves. And thank you for conversations like this, because we live in a world that has a lot of questions. And Father, I pray you might give us wisdom to know how to give an answer for the hope that we have, but to do that with gentleness and respect. Father, I pray that tonight you would work through Dr. Meyer, you would work through our conversation, so that we might learn how to more effectively share the good news of the gospel and answer questions that often hinder people from considering the good news of the gospel. For it's in Jesus' name and for his sake that we pray. Amen. Join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Meyer.
Ed mentioned that we'll have a question and answer time afterwards, which I really look forward to and appreciate. My first year in grad school, he mentioned that I studied in England. In my first year in grad school, I was a little bit intimidated by the whole Cambridge scene. And there was a lecturer who came, a visiting professor who came, who was an expert on the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And he gave a mind-blowing lecture, and he was talking about things that I had never learned about as an undergraduate. I'd taken a little bit of philosophy. I had a minor. I think I actually took a class on Immanuel Kant, but I hadn't heard the things that the professor was telling about Kant's view of aesthetics or ethics or something. And I remember asking in the middle of the lecture if he had, if there was a source, a book where I could read more about that part of Kant's philosophy. And there was a kind of uncomfortable shuffling in the room, and the professor indulged my question, mentioned something, but it was clear maybe this wasn't the kind of question that people asked. And afterwards, my supervisor, an Oxbridge Don of the old school, took me aside and he said, Maya, I know in the States you've learned the only stupid question is the one you didn't ask. And then he said, it's different here. And he took me aside. He said, if you in future, he said, if you're to ask a question that reveals ignorance, come ask me in private, he said. So anyway, I am looking forward to the Q&A, but it will be American rules, no stupid questions, so all comers. Anyway, let's start with Darwin's Doubt. When Darwin finished his great masterpiece, The Origin of Species, he thought he had explained every clue but one. And the one clue that he knew he hadn't explained was an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian Explosion. The Cambrian Explosion is the geologically abrupt or sudden appearance of most of the major groups of animals and the body plans that they exhibit. A body plan is a unique arrangement of body parts and tissues. It's a unique way of arranging the parts that make up an animal. And the first animals that arrive in the Cambrian period exemplify most of the major body plans that have ever existed on planet Earth. Not all of them, but most of them. And I give a count in the book. percentage. It's something like 26 out of 36. Okay. In any case, it's a big explosion of new biological forms that did not exist prior to the Cambrian. And what was curious about it, and here's some of the, we have artists who's depicted some of the different types of animals that first arose. And they arise abruptly. Now, remember, just animals, we use animals colloquially to refer to mammals. But mammals are one type of animal in the phylum Chordata. Lots of other architectures, body architectures of animals. And they arise abruptly in the fossil record. I love this figure because it shows the sedimentary column with the different layers of rock on one side, the different animals as they arise, the ages in the standard millions of years on the left, the geological time scale, and most of these major animal forms arise very abruptly in about, the accepted time today is within about a 10 million year window. And I show in the book that there's 13 to 16 new body plans that arise within a 5 to 6 million year window, about the extent of the resolution of the fossil dating. I mean, really abruptly. And so it's quite striking. And what's striking was striking to Darwin at the time. He didn't know about all these forms that we know about today, but the forms that did arise so abruptly didn't have ancestral forms in the lower Precambrian strata, the intermediates, the fossil intermediates that he expected to be there based on his theory. So here's another way of depicting this with the geologic ages. The Cambrian is a period in the Paleozoic, the first one, way long time ago, way down in the fossil record, whichever way you want to think of it, and the explosion is very abrupt. And yet we get most of the major styles of animal life, forms of animal life, arising in that very, very narrow window of time very abruptly. Okay? Now here's the reason it was so puzzling to Darwin. On Darwin's idea, remember, if you were here in the morning, and I guess not everyone was, but evolution can mean a number of different things. It can mean simply change over time. It can also mean the idea of universal common ancestry, the idea that the best picture of the history of life is a picture that shows all the forms of life connected to a common root or trunk, and then all the forms gradually arising little by little as that first single-celled organism would have morphed and changed and reproduced, and morphed and changed more, and little tiny changes accumulating over time. So it's a picture of continuous biological change over a long period of time. That's Darwin's view. And the first animals should have, like everything else, formed a tree-like pattern with the gold dots at the top representing the animals that we actually find in the fossil record. The blue dots would be the intermediate forms, the ancestral intermediates that ought to be there if Darwin's theory is correct, but for some reason are not there in the lower Precambrian strata. And Darwin was aware of this disparity between his picture of the history of life and the actual pattern that we find in the fossilization of the first animals. By the way, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, this explosion of animal life is not by any means the only such explosion in the history of life. This tends to be the pervasive pattern, the abrupt appearance of major innovation, whether it's at the level of the, I didn't say anything about this, biological classification. The phyla are the largest group of in classification of animals. They represent the biggest divisions, the biggest differences. And then the smaller divisions represent smaller groups within those divisions. And the terms are phylum for the biggest division, class, slightly smaller division, orders, families, genus, species. It all familiar from high school biology or college. Anyway, I learned that kings play chess on fine green sand. Kingdom, phyla, class, okay, in mnemonic to remember it. Anyway, the animal phyla represent the big divisions that represent big differences in the way of organizing body parts, big changes in animal organization or body plans. Classes can also represent differences in body plans. Okay, so the Darwinian picture is the tree, and yet what we see in the fossil record with the first animals is this abrupt, is a picture more like a lawn, or maybe like an orchard of separate trees where there's a little variation within the phylum or the class as it arises, but all the trunks don't marry up into one big tree. Okay, so here's the tension. The data on the top, this is idealized, obviously, not capturing everything, and the theory on the bottom. And the tree-like picture is not matching what we're seeing in the fossil record. And that's the mystery of the Cambrian explosion, at least the first mystery. I call it the mystery of the missing fossils. And it bothered Darwin, and he understood that it was, well, here's what he said about it. He said, as to the question why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods, prior to the Cambrian system, the system of fossilization, I can give no satisfactory answer. It was a mystery to him. It didn't make sense in light of his theory. He didn't think his theory was wrong. That would be too strong to say that he thought his theory was wrong. He thought he was right, but he recognized that if his theory was right, it couldn't explain this. Okay. What I do in the book Darwin's Doubt is I tell the story of the mystery of the Cambrian explosion and also what's become of it. Because as I argue in the book, the mystery that seemed to Darwin to be a kind of isolated anomaly, a kind of the one clue he couldn't explain, has grown up to reveal a much more profound mystery and challenge to his theory, so much so that leading evolutionary biologists are now calling for a new theory of evolution. I was at a conference in November of last year in London, the Royal Society Conference, and at the Royal Society, there were leading evolutionary biologists, and the conference had actually been called to investigate the status of Neo-Darwinism, the modern form of Darwin's theory, and the need for a new theory, because so many scientists are now questioning, evolutionary biologists are questioning, the creative power of the standard mutation natural selection mechanism. But we'll get to that. In any case, one thing I really appreciate about Darwin in this statement, and by the way, if you haven't read The Origin of Species, it's a beautifully argued book. He's like a lawyer arguing a case. He says it's one long argument. So his rhetorical skill it's very British, and he does a really good job arguing his case. But he also, one thing I like about him is that there was a great deal of rhetorical modesty. When he couldn't explain something, he'd tell you. I contrast that today with with the group of scientists that I call Darwin's public defenders. These are the scientists, unlike these leading evolutionary biologists I was talking about just a second ago, who are defending Darwin to the hilt. There are no problems in the theory, we're told. And I testified before the Texas State Board of Education several years ago. The state board there was considering a proposal to encourage teachers to teach the strengths and weaknesses of competing scientific theories when students learn about the scientific theories. Seemed like sweet reason to everybody, but the Darwin-only science education lobby turned out in force to oppose this resolution. And they said, you can't apply that standard to our theory or to Darwin's theory because and this was a quote from Eugenie Scott, who was the head of the National Center for Science Education at the time. And she was quoted in the Dallas Morning News as saying, there are no weaknesses in evolution, so you can't apply the standard to the theory. I was gobsmacked, as the British say. I was there to present into evidence 100 peer-reviewed papers that were raising significant scientific problems with the contemporary version of Darwin's theory. I knew there were plenty of weaknesses, but we couldn't even, someone was going to kind of basically stonewall and say there are no problems here. Houston, we have no problems. Anyway, other Darwinians have been similarly dogmatic. Richard Dawkins, well-known figure worldwide, the great proponent of the new atheism and also of Neo-Darwinism, the blind watchmaker thesis, as he calls it. He says it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. And then he says parenthetically, or wicked. But I'd rather not consider that. I always thought that was so sporting of him not to think that people who disagreed with him were wicked. That's all. In fact, that's a very good policy, really, not to assume that people who disagree are wicked. Anyway, the great thing about Darwin, he made a powerful case for his theory, but he also acknowledged the problems. And so, in discussing the Cambrian explosion, he says very explicitly, the case at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the view here entertained. So that's what I call the mystery of the missing fossils. Now, I'm not going to talk too much more about the mystery of the missing fossils tonight, because I want to talk about the deeper mystery that Darwinian evolution exposes. The Cambrian explosion exposes. Let me touch on just a few aspects of this, though. Darwin, that slide's better on the screen. Darwin was a clever guy, And he had an idea about how he might be able to explain the mystery of the missing fossils. And that was that it's something now known as the artifact hypothesis. It's the idea that the absence of ancestral intermediates for these major explosive events in the history of life is an artifact of either incomplete sampling, we haven't looked hard enough, or incomplete preservation of the fossils. That for some reason they weren't the depositional environments where the fossils were deposited when they died, the animals died, were just not suited to preserving them. So we either haven't looked hard enough or they weren't, for some reason, preserved. And Darwin expected that future fossil finds would fill in those gaps. Now, and here's just very briefly the story I tell in 7 chapters in the book. There have been subsequent fossil finds, and they have accentuated the gaps. There have been 2 major Cambrian finds, one at the Burgess Shale, another one in southern China, both of which established that there were not just the animals of which Darwin knew in the 1850s and 60s that first arose in the Cambrian, but a whole range of other exotic animal forms that Darwin had no clue about. Stephen Jay Gould wrote a whole book about this called Wonderful Life. And I had the privilege this summer for the second time of hiking to the top of the Burgess Shale to see some of these creatures. It's really cool. But here's the bottom line point, is that as we've discovered more and more fossils, they have not filled in the gaps. They've shown that there are more gaps because there are more Cambrian animal forms. There's more, the breadth of the explosion was greater than we realized. More forms, each of which is lacking an ancestral chain in the lower Precambrian strata. So the explosion became more explosive, at least from our point of view. We realized that it was more explosive, okay? Now, so I'm going to skip over some things that in a longer talk I'd address, and I'd show you some of these weird exotic forms, and I have an animation reel. We have a film on this we've done called Darwin's Dilemma that you might want to get a hold of. This is a little dude called Opabinia. He is worth talking about. The 5 eyes, a long proboscis with a pincher, articulated body, kind of like a shrimp. Unbelievably interesting creatures in the Cambrian. Anyway, several years ago, one of the leading Chinese paleontologists who'd been involved in the really big Chinese find that it made the Time magazine cover story. And he came to the United States, and we sponsored a lecture. Discovery Institute, the institute of which I'm a part, sponsored a lecture at the local research university, the University of Washington in Seattle. And when people heard that Chen was coming and that Chen was bringing fossils, and when they heard about the Time magazine story, meant we had a good crowd. And he gave a fascinating lecture and told us about all these different amazing creatures. And I don't have time to talk about them. I would in a longer talk, but this was the top of the food chain predator, Animalocarids, and lots of different animal forms that had been discovered in the Cambrian. This guy I love, he's called a ctenophore, little comb jelly. We have them in Puget Sound, and in 530 million years, they haven't changed. It's a phenomenon in the fossil record called stasis. It's absence of directional change. It's also a very pervasive feature of the fossil record, so kind of mysterious from a Darwinian point of view. This is one of the first fishes that was discovered. So we now know that fish were present in the Cambrian way back, so another animal form. So the explosion got more explosive. Chen talked about the amazing discoveries, and then near the end of his talk, Professor Chen, he takes his hand and he says, these fossil finds turn Darwin's tree of life upside down. And suddenly you could feel a little uncomfortable shuffling in the room. And he continued and finished his talk, and after the talk was over, one of the professors, or one of the geologists, I think it was, in the audience says, Professor Chen, a fascinating discussion, but I'm a little uneasy about what you were saying about Darwinism. Aren't you a little uneasy talking about Darwinian evolution that way, coming as you do from such an authoritarian country? And suddenly it was even more uncomfortable in the room because the American professor had just insulted China, which is a kind of big country, and our speaker was from that country. And so anyway, Professor Chen didn't miss a beat. He got a kind of wry smile on his face, and he said, yes, I know about this. He said, in the United States, or he said in China, we can question Darwinism. just not the government. He said, in the United States, you can question the government, but you mustn't question Darwinism, he said. And he'd heard about political correctness in our universities and something, I don't know. So anyway, it's a fascinating little exchange, but it underscores the degree of suppressed dissent there is about this theory in the scientific community. And that this mystery of the missing fossils hasn't been solved at all. In fact, another find in China revealed something really, really cool, but also puzzling from a Darwinian point of view. In the layers, just beneath the layers that document the Cambrian explosion, these would be late pre-Cambrian layers. It's called the Dushantu Shale. The Cambrian fossils in China are in a formation called the Maoshishan Shale. And beneath that, at the very end of the Precambrian, there's a layer called the Dushantu Shale where you'd really expect to find the intermediates. They have found some fossils, but they're small, microscopic, and likely sponge embryos. So they're soft-bodied, microscopic animals, the very kind of thing that isn't supposed to be preserved if the depositional environments aren't any good. And so the question was raised, well, sponges are a primitive animal form, and we did know of them before from late in the Precambrian. So it wasn't a big discovery that there were sponges there. What was puzzling was that there were sponges there, and there were no other forms of animal life there. Because then it raised the question, if you can preserve an animal, or if you can preserve a soft, microscopic, likely as an embryo, sponge embryo, why couldn't you preserve the ancestral forms of all the other Cambrian animals, that many of which would have had hard parts? Where are they? And many of the Chinese paleontologists have concluded the best explanation for why the ancestors of all the other animal forms weren't there was because they weren't there. That the explosion was real. And now two leading American paleontologists have come to the same conclusion, Valentine and Irwin. They wrote a book in 2013, the same year that Darwin's Doubt came out. They're Cambrian experts, and they said basically, whatever you make of the Cambrian explosion, you have to acknowledge that it was a real event. It's not an artifact of incomplete sampling. We've been looking for 160 years now. It's not an artifact of incomplete preservation. It was a real event. So that's the mystery of the missing fossils. Enough on that, though. All of this exposes a deeper mystery, which is the one that really interests me. If you look at life, in a sense, from an engineering point of view, asking the question, what would it take to build these new forms of life? Especially since they arise so quickly in the geological record. And by the way, we talked about the Cambrian explosion is it's geologically very abrupt and fast. Because if you accept the standard time scale of 4.5 billion years, this is like 8 seconds in a 20, make 4.5 billion years the length of a day. This is like 8 seconds in a day, and you get all this animal form. Okay, so geologically it's very abrupt. It turns out to be also very abrupt biologically speaking, because there's a branch of evolutionary biology known as population genetics that allows you to calculate how much evolutionary change you would expect in a given amount of time. Or conversely, how long it would take for a given evolutionary change to take place. And people are now doing calculations based on structures that would require 2 or more coordinated mutations. And when you get past 3 coordinated mutations, what are called the waiting times blow up exponentially beyond the available time since life has been on Earth. So 10 million years, 5 million years, some people say, well, maybe it was 20 million. It doesn't matter. It's a blink of the eye biologically in relation to how fast the natural selection random mutation mechanism should be able to work based on Neo-Darwinian theory. Okay, not based on some tract from the Creation Research Institute or something. No, this is standard Neo-Darwinian math, and it says we need a lot more time than the Cambrian event to build that much form. Okay, so it's mysterious however you cut it. So in any case, here's the little picture again, but the big question is the origin, how do you build these animals, especially in the amount of time available? Now I think this question gets much more mysterious and becomes more acute when we begin to think about all the things that have been discovered since the 1950s and 60s and 70s and right up to the present in the field of molecular biology. You think, well, what's that got to do with fossils? Well, we'll bring it all together in a minute. Remember Watson and Crick, 1953? They elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule. They figure out the structure of the molecule. They also realize there's something about the molecule that suggests that it might be able to carry information. And 4 years later, in 1957, Francis Crick puts forward a bold conjecture called the sequence hypothesis, in which he proposes that the chemical bases, there are subunits on the inside of the double helix, and he proposes that these subunits of the DNA are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language, or like the digital characters, the zeros and ones that we use in computer code today. Which is to say, it's not the chemical properties of these individual parts of the molecule that are responsible for the job that the molecule does. It's their arrangement, their precise arrangement in accord with a code, later discovered, a code called the genetic code. Turns out that Crick is right. I think it's fascinating. I think mentioned in one of the other classes that he was a code breaker in World War II. And also was not even a properly trained biologist, which is also fun. He was a PhD student at the time working in physics, and it was just an amazing story. They broke every rule of proper scientific protocol to make this discovery, Watson and Crick. They do make it, however, and then Crick, who is the real genius in the pair, says, this molecule is carrying information in digital form. Now, in Seattle, we have the Boeing company and the Microsoft company. Forgive me if you heard this before, if you were here at one of the other talks, but I think for people who weren't here, it's a good illustration of what's going on. And Microsoft writes code and sells it, okay? So we know that information is a real thing. We buy it, we sell it, we send it down wires. It's real and it's valuable, right? The Boeing company uses information to build mechanical systems. It uses a technology called CAD/CAM, Computer-Assisted Design and Engineering. And so an engineer will sit at a console, write some code. For helping to build, say, an airplane wing. The code goes down the wire. It's translated into a different machine code that can be read at the manufacturing apparatus. That code is then taken and used to, say, put the rivets on the airplane in just the right place. So the digital information is being used to construct a physical mechanical system. That's what's going on inside cells. The information inside the DNA molecule is being used to construct the large protein molecules that are necessary to keep cells alive. Now, we have a shorter period for this tonight. If I were teaching this, I'd show you all of this. But this is a neat animation showing how the digital information directs the construction of proteins, okay? And while I'm talking, we might just let it run. But I'd encourage you, if you want to know more, to go online. For us, it's a very popular video. It's not like, anyway, it's not like one of those stars that you read about in the magazines, that kind of YouTube exposure. But we've had 500,000 views of this. It's called Journey Inside the Cell, okay? My kids show me these little goofy videos on YouTube, and they've got 3 million or 5 million, and I think, what do we have to do to get people to... Anyway, so let's talk about proteins while the animation is running, okay? So proteins are made of smaller subunits called amino acids. And amino acids link up into forming these long chain-like molecules, and if there's the right sequence of amino acids, they will fold into these beautiful three-dimensional shapes. And if the shapes are right, then the protein can do a job in the cell. It can form it might be a part of a molecular machine, and we're discovering little nanomachines inside cells today. It's absolutely fascinating. Rotary engines, sliding clamps, little turbines on a nanoscale made of proteins. And the nanomachines, this is awesome. Okay, this is the digital code coming. These are called transfer RNAs. They bring the amino acids in one by one, so the codons determine which amino acid gets linked together, and if the codons are right with the information from the DNA strand that gets translated to RNA, it builds the protein, chunk, 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 in this very mechanical way, all governed by the information in the original molecule. That then arranges these amino acids in the right way, and then they fold into three-dimensional shapes. If they have the right shapes, then they do the right jobs. It's like the toolbox out in your garage. You've got a hammer, a saw, a wrench, a pliers, and each one of them can do a different job in virtue of their shape. largely, okay? And it's the same thing with the proteins. There's thousands of them. If they have the right shape, they can do all these, they can do a specific job. But they only get the right shape if the amino acids are arranged properly, and the amino acids get arranged properly because of the information on DNA directing that whole process, just like the CAD/CAM guys at Boeing, okay? Make sense at all? Okay, it's so cool. It's really cool, okay? So, okay, we're not going to get into that. So, here's what's all this got to do with the Cambrian explosion? If you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? A program. You've got to give it code. The same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new form of life from a pre-existing form, you've got to have new cell types, new types of cells. And each new type of cell needs new proteins. And each new protein requires a program. It requires more code. So the Cambrian explosion, the explosion of all these new animal forms, is also an explosion of information. The information provides the form. Okay. Now, it might be just helpful to make one quick distinction. Yeah, here's the concept. You want to get a new form of life, you got to have new code. You got to have new code, okay? Now, one thing to be cognizant of is that the kind of information that we have in DNA is not the kind that information theorists or engineers talk about when they're measuring the amount of information in a string of characters. And this might be just a fine point that's unnecessary, but if there are engineers in the audience, you know about Shannon's theory of information. Shannon measured his theory of information just measured the improbability of a string of characters. It couldn't tell you whether the string of characters was functional or not. So, can you see there's a difference between the string on the top and the string on the bottom? They both have the same probability of occurrence because they're both made with the same keyboard and have the same number of characters. But the string on the top lacks something that the string on the bottom has. It's meaning. Somebody said the word orderly. We avoid that word because order can refer to repetitive order, like ABC, 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 or NaCl, 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 the kind of order we have in a crystal, okay? So in information theory, we'll talk about order. Both of these strings are complex. They're not rigidly repeating. They're complex and therefore improbable, but the string on the bottom has something special. It's complex and it's also specified. The arrangement is specified to perform a function, a communication function. So the kind of information we have in DNA is this second kind. It's not just the mathematical definition of information, an improbable string of characters. It's an improbable string that's also arranged very specifically to do a job. It's like computer code or written text in that sense, okay? So that's the kind of information that we have that we need to build new animals. First, we need new cell types. The cell types need new proteins, and that's what you need to build these new animals. So the Cambrian explosion is an explosion of information. Now, because the information is specified, because the arrangement of the characters needs to be what it is within fine tolerances, you can't go mucking with the arrangements without hoping to destroy the specificity of the sequence, which is necessary to build the functional proteins. There was a conference back in the 1960s where this problem was first raised. It was a group of scientists from MIT. They'd had a picnic, and they found that the math guys and the biology guys disagreed. The biologists were talking about all the new wonderful discoveries in biology, including the information-bearing properties of DNA and the sequence hypothesis and the gene expression system and all this. And the computer science and physics guys said, well, if that's true, if DNA is really an information-carrying molecule, we don't quite get how your Neo-Darwinian thing works. Because we know from writing computer code that if you start altering the characters in a section of meaningful or functional text, functional code, you're going to destroy the function long before you're ever going to get anything new that's useful. And yet you guys are telling us that DNA is an informational molecule, and the evolutionary process works by mutations accumulating in those sequences of bases that are carrying the information. Mutations being random changes that alter the sequence. And so one of the leading computer scientists at the time, Murray Eden, said in the conference that they ended up convening a conference to air out these differences with the biologists and the physics and math and computer science people. It was called Mathematical Challenges to Neo-Darwinism. It was in Philadelphia, Wistar Institute, 1966. Proceedings published in 67. Murray Eden at the conference says this. He says, no currently existing formal language can tolerate random changes in the symbol sequences which express its sentences. Meaning is almost invariably destroyed. Okay? That's the problem. And I will just ask the rhetorical question in lectures if they're computer scientists. If you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of functional code in a program or operating system, are you likely to get will you get, what's going to happen? Will you degrade information or add information? And say, well, degrade. And will you degrade information and they'll say, long before you ever get anything useful or new? Okay? You'll lose function. We don't like glitches. We don't like bugs. We don't like that stuff when we're using, when we have information-rich systems. Okay? So here's the problem. Let me give you another take on why the math people are worrying about this. It's because why do random changes in information-rich sequences invariably degrade information? Well, because there's a lot more ways to go wrong than there are to go right. There's a lot more ways to organize English letters that will result in gibberish than will result in you getting the triple word score when you're playing Scrabble, right? You know, just reaching in the bag is not a good way to win the game. And in English, here's a little factoid. For a 12-letter sequence or string, for every sequence that is either a functional word or phrase, 12 letters long, there are 100 trillion other ways of arranging those same 26 letters that will give you something that's meaningless. You don't think about this very often, but it has, and I'll show you why. Well, this is what was worrying the computer scientists. If this is really an information-carrying molecule, and DNA if this is typographic or alphabetic in character, then we're going to get lots more ways to go wrong than right, and so mutations are inevitably going to drop you into a non-functional abyss. Illustration. Out in front of the church, we can imagine that there is a lovely new bicycle. On the bicycle is a standard 4-character lock. We have out in front of the church a very dedicated thief who would like to open the lock. But he's got a problem, doesn't he? He's got a lot more ways to go wrong than to go right. For every sequence that will open the lock, namely 1, there are 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, or 10 to the 4th power numbers of other combinations. A lot more ways to go wrong than right. In fact, 9,999, okay? So if the thief is trying to open the lock at random, is it more likely that he'll succeed or fail? But I have a trick question. It was a trick question. If you're right, if he only has a couple of tries, right? But what if it's a particularly dedicated thief? And this lecture is going to go on interminably tonight. Maybe 15 hours. I've made the calculations. If the thief has 15 hours and can try one combination every 10 seconds, no potty breaks, no lunch breaks, the thief can get to 5,400 combinations in 15 hours. Once you get over 5,000, his brain shuts down. Yeah. No, once you get over 5,000, then you've sampled more than half. And at that point, it becomes more likely that you'll succeed than it is that you will fail. Right? Okay. Now, what if the thief, however, encounters this lock? I've made the same calculations. If the thief lives 100 years, takes no potty breaks, never eats, never drinks, never does anything but change dials, one every 10 seconds, the thief will sample less than 3% of the total numbers of combinations. Okay? In other words, in that case, he doesn't have what are called enough probabilistic resources, enough opportunities to sample more than half, at which case it becomes more likely than not that he will fail than that he will succeed. So, and notice what else. If I'm a betting person and I say, I'm betting that he will fail, or I'm betting that he will succeed, at that point, my bet on the chance or random search hypothesis is more likely to be false than true. Okay, do you see how it converts into a way of assessing hypotheses? So What's the point? The point is if we're trying to assess the plausibility of a random search as a means of generating new information, we need to know how many possibilities need to be searched and how many opportunities there are to do the searching. Make sense? That's why I asked the trick question, because I wanted to elicit that intuition, all right? So we need to know two things. Now the question what's all this got to do with? We're trying to build information, right, to explain the Cambrian animals. The question is the Darwinian mechanism confronted with, in building new genes and proteins, which we need to build anything new in life, is the Darwinian mechanism confronting a problem like the 4-dial lock or the 10-dial lock? In other words, are there enough probabilistic resources to find the new information, or are there not enough? And this has led to some really interesting research with people in molecular biology who have effectively wanted to find out what's the ratio when we're talking about a new gene or a new protein. Is it more like the 10-dial or the 4-dial? And I'm going to shorten this story just a little bit, but here's something that's been determined experimentally. In the case of a modest length protein, average length proteins are about 300 amino acids long. A modest length one, about half of that, 150. So a scientist has done some very careful work on this, a protein scientist who worked 14 years on this problem at Cambridge University. His name is Douglas Axe, Caltech PhD, no slouch, publishes research in the Journal of Molecular Biology. He determined that the ratio of functional folds, that's where the protein folds up and could perform a function into a nice, stable, three-dimensional structure, to the number of sequences that don't fold and couldn't perform a function, the gibberish. In other words, what we want to know is like the ratio of a functional sequence to the gibberish sequences. For a protein of modest length, the ratio is 1 over 10 to the 77th power. That's like a lock like this, okay, with 77 dials. We can't really get our minds around the number 10 to the 77, but it might help for you to know that there are 10 to the 65th atoms in the Milky Way galaxy, okay? So we're talking about, what was that, another 10 billion, it's like finding one marked atom in 10 billion Milky Way galaxies. That's the problem. That's the ratio. That's the thief is looking for one combination that will open the lock against, in the 4-dial lock, 10,000. We're looking for one combination against, it's like one marked atom against all the atoms in 10 billion Milky Way galaxies. That's the size of the search problem that has to be solved. For one gene capable of building one protein of a modest length, all right? But wait, there's something else we need to know, right? That makes us think, well, it's never going to happen, but wait, maybe it could, because how many trials, how many opportunities do we have? Well, that's actually, there are good scientific estimates of that as well. It turns out that there are about 10 to the 40th organisms that have ever lived on the planet, including bacteria and everything all the way back. And that's a lot. So that's a lot of opportunities, because every time an organism replicates, it shuffles the deck. And there could be mutations at that point that are accumulated. But 10 to the 40th is a tiny portion of 10 to the 77th. I don't know if you remember this part from math, but when you've got exponents like this, dividing, you subtract. So 10 to the 40 over 10 to the 77th is 1 over 10 to the 37th, which is the ultimate probability. That's 1 over 10 trillion trillion trillionth. It's 1 10 trillion trillion trillionth. That's the fraction. So just to put this back in some kind of perspective, imagine an enormous haystack the size of, say, Seattle to Chicago, and you're looking for one needle in that haystack, but you only get to search 1 10 trillion trillion trillionth the size of the haystack, one little tiny corner somewhere in Montana or something. If you're confined, if your search can only search that small of this haystack, are you more likely to find the needle or not? You're more likely to fail. You're overwhelmingly more likely to fail to find the needle, which means that the hypothesis that that's how you did find the needle is overwhelmingly more likely to be false than true, or that the hypothesis that the needle would ever be found. Right? So I hope this is this is tough stuff, but fun. What's the bottom line? the Neo-Darwinian mechanism of natural selection acting on random genetic mutations is not an adequate mechanism for generating the new information you would need to build even one new gene or protein if we take into account the entire history of life on Earth. And therefore, it doesn't explain the Cambrian explosion, because you need a lot more than one new gene and one new protein. And remember, natural selection only acts after the fact of a successful search. It selects for functional advantage. So you got to rely on the mutations to find the information. Natural selection can only preserve it, it can't create it. So this is one of many reasons that this Cambrian explosion has become a really profound mystery in the history of life, because you can't build the information necessary to build the animals. Now, I got interested in the intelligent design idea back when I was a scientist working in the oil industry. A conference came to our town, and it was about the origin of life, and some scientists there proposed the idea that they were also concerned with this information problem. It turns out whether you're talking about biological evolution, which is explaining new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms, or chemical evolution, there is not a plausible means of generating the information. And so this origin of information is a big, big problem in both branches of evolutionary theory. I encountered it with scientists who were talking about the origin of the very first life, and they suggested that maybe what we were looking at was evidence of an intelligent cause. Because in our experience, they said, information is a mind product. It's something that intelligent agents produce. And there was a book written in the 1980s called The Mystery of Life's Origin. I got to know the scientist who wrote it. His name was Charles Thaxton. And he suggested maybe this is what we're looking at. We need to be open to this possibility in science. So I left my job at the oil company, and a year later I was off to Cambridge, and I had a burning question in the back of my mind, which was, could this idea of intelligence being the explanation for the origin of information, could that have some scientific merit? Could we formulate that as a scientific hypothesis, a rigorous scientific argument, in fact? That led me, interestingly, to study the works of Charles Darwin, because Darwin had developed a method of scientific investigation for events in the remote past, events a long time ago. And he realized that if you're trying to figure out what caused something to happen a long time ago, you don't have the luxury of getting to replicate that event in the laboratory under controlled conditions. You're not using the same experimental methods of science that scientists use in the laboratory. So he thought, he devised a different method, and the method has a name. It's called the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or the method of inference to the best explanation. And that led to an interesting question, which is, well, what does it mean to be a best explanation? How do we decide which possible explanation is the best for a given criteria or for a given event? As I was thinking about that, I was reading the works of one of Darwin's mentors, a geologist named Charles Lyell, and he was thinking about the same problem. And on the title page of his book, he said that it was a long Victorian subtitle. I about fell asleep reading it, and I got to the end, and then suddenly I woke up. Because he says that he's talking about the principles of geology, which are an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface, events a long time ago, and then he said the phrase that got my attention, by causes now in operation. What does it mean to be a best explanation? Well, the best explanation is one which invokes a cause which we know from our present experience is operative. It's a cause now in operation. And that led me to ask a really important question. I think it was important to me, at least, which was, what's the cause now in operation for the production of digital code, of the information that you would need to build the first life or to build new forms of life? What do we know from our present experience about what it takes to generate information? And I came across a passage in a little book about the application of information concepts to biology. And the scientist said, just in an offhand way, page 16, I remember it was like bolt out of the blue, the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. In other words, what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, another phrase from Darwin and Lyell, is that information always arises from a mind, from a rational agent. And I thought, could that first of all, is that true? And I was thinking about the DNA thing. Bill Gates says that DNA is like a computer program, only much more complex than any we've ever devised. What do we know about where computer programs come from? From our uniform and repeated experience. Well, from programmers, from intelligent agents, right? And so I thought, well, wait, that's what we know from our experience, from our uniform and repeated experience, which Darwin and Lyell are saying is the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past. And so that suggests that maybe there's a scientific basis for this idea of intelligent design. And I got to thinking about it more, and I thought, well, it's not just computer programs. It's hieroglyphic inscriptions, it's paragraphs in books, it's information in radio signals, it's even the information that evolutionary biologists use to make their they write these programs to simulate how the evolutionary process could generate new information, but the information always comes from the computer programmer who wrote the simulation to make sure that the program would always succeed. So we have a breadth of experience that shows that information always comes from an intelligent source. So when we see an event like the Cambrian Explosion in the history of life, which represents a huge infusion of new information into the biological world, I argue that what we're looking at is evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence in the history of life. In fact, I'm using the method of reasoning that Darwin laid out. Because what I do in the book is I look at and I shortened, obviously, the big book, but there are many different evolutionary models now that are attempting to explain the origin of form and information. And what I found is that in addition to the standard Neo-Darwinian method, the other evolutionary models also do not explain the origin of information. They typically presuppose unexplained sources of information. So my argument then is that intelligent design actually represents an inference to the best explanation for the origin of the information necessary to build the Cambrian animals. And that, I argue, is not just that is a scientific argument because we're using the very same method of scientific reasoning that Darwin himself pioneered. So if you want to say intelligent design isn't science, you'd have to say that Darwinian evolution isn't science as well. We're using the same method. We're just coming to a different conclusion based on things that Darwin didn't know about, in particular, this fascinating digital information that we now know is necessary to build the Cambrian animals. So that's my case for intelligent design, and let's do some Q&A. Yeah.
Join me in thanking Dr.
Yeah.
Meyer.